let's talk about how all this began with my special guest, Ryan Graham, who's the author of so many books. By the way, thank you for the Cecile Bruyere book. I just want to share this with the audience. And I couldn't find it at mediatrixpress.com. Is it there?
Oh yeah, it's there. Although it's there in the general listing of everything.
Okay.
I went through it because it got me interested. As I started looking, as I was going to link that up, it was like, hey, I never built a landing page for it, or if I did, I accidentally deleted it or something, so I had to build a new one. So it's there now, and actually, it's on the sidebar.
And what's the book?
So the book is Cecile Bruyere. I know I'm saying her name wrong because I have no faculty whatsoever in French. She was a spiritual disciple of Prosper Guéranger, and Dom Guéranger had restored the Benedictine order to France in the 19th century in the aftermath of the French Revolution. Because remember, one of the French revolutionary ideas, which actually, this is an older idea, but the French Revolution was really strong on this, is that contemplative orders, monastic orders, they don't do any good for the state. They're just sitting around praying all day, right? You're useless eaters taken away from the thrift of the state. So we got to expel. So Carthusians were all expelled in French revolutionary countries. And this was also done in people with similar ideas, like for the pushing Febronianism. So Joseph II of Austria did the same thing. Discalced Carmelites, booted out. We don't need you. Benedictines. So a lot of the Benedictine monasteries got seized by the French revolutionary state. The monks booted out, sometimes put in prisons, mercilessly martyred. A good number of Benedictine martyrs are from the French Revolution, or from England under Protestantism, alternatively. So the Benedictines were gone, so Dom Prosper Guéranger brought them back into France. And he also, at the same time as he was rebuilding the monastery, he was also restoring the church's tradition in Gregorian chant as best he could. And there's some critics of it in the way he did things, but nevertheless, the bare basics of what the chant was, how it was interpreted. And he rescued chant where it had been completely overshadowed by big orchestra set type pieces, some of which are very beautiful, but also recovering the simplicity of the church's chant, which was lost.
Right.
And so a lot of the Reformed Gregorian chant bases, it's thanks to Guéranger that we have it. So, and he was also a great spiritual writer. So if you've ever read The Liturgical Year, you can find this. They have it online. Different publishers carry it. Loretto has it. St. Bonaventure Publications has it. It's pretty easy to find. It's a fantastic work for following the extraordinary form of the Mass, minus a handful of things that are different in the rubrics. So a great spiritual commentary on the history of the feast days, on theological elements dealing with the Mass. Just fantastic work all around. So Bruyere was one of his disciples, and so she had founded a convent of Benedictine nuns carrying the same reforms of Guéranger over to England, and I believe that she founded a convent in the Isle of Wight, unless I'm mistaken. And so she wrote a couple of different books, all of which are in French, I believe, except for this one. And so the Spiritual Life and Prayer was originally translated by the nuns at Stanbrook, I think. But nevertheless, so it breaks down basically how to live the spiritual life from the monastic tradition. So it's both for, say, monks or oblates and nuns, how, living the Benedictine rule in the monastic tradition, how they can live the fullness of the spiritual life and the contemplative life. And through all the different facets of the habit, obedience, prayer, the monastic office, and everything. But it's also for the layman, too, right?
Yes.
And how to even incorporate all of these things into their life. And that's what always a great thing, sanctity is not just for the priests and the monks and the nuns, right? People, like when I was in seminary, people told my mom, wow, your ticket for heaven's punched because your son's going to be a priest, right? And people have these kind of ridiculous ideas. If only it were so. But no, your ticket for heaven should be punched as a layman too, by a constant life working out your salvation in fear and trembling. And how do you do that? And that's really, this book tells you how to do it with the simplicity, with prayer, trust in God, and just the contemplative devotion. That's one thing that Vatican II says that it really just echoes the whole Christian tradition. Sanctity ain't just for the clergy; it's for everybody.
I just wanted to mention the book Spiritual Life and Prayer, because about 3/4 of the way through it. It's probably taken me about a year to get that far. I read very slow, and I got 20 books going at the same time. But I probably have 25, 30 pages dog-eared. Probably have another 30 or so marked up, scribbled on with pens or whatever I had nearby at the time. It's one of those books that it looks innocent enough, and especially with the cover, with the monk there with the skull on the desk, it looks innocent enough. You're going like, yeah, well, that title's not really inspired. It's not really doing anything for me. You pick that book up though and start reading it, especially if you have a daily prayer regimen. If you have one, and instantly you'll be hooked, because she'll just draw you right in and take you through. I don't want to spend too much time on this. She takes you through the 3 stages: the purgative, the spirative, and what's the third one? The contemplative. On the purgative, contemplative, what's the third one? There's 3 stages she takes. Anyways, I'm stuck in the second one. I went into the first chapter of the third one and went, yeah, I ain't there yet. Let me go back to the second one and practice that one a little bit. Anyways, get it at Ryan's site, Mediatrix, Mediatrix Press.com. And when our shipment arrives, I have 1 copy that Ryan was able to squirrel away from me. When Maggie O'Connell can put it up in the store, we'll have it, but I know that he has it. Now, let's get to the topic at hand here. So Ryan Grant is the author of many, the translator of too many books to list here. Some of them that we have in the Founders Trading Post, though, are the controversy on the Roman pontiffs, the Bellarmine's work about the Pope, volumes 1 and 2, the volume 3, which is about the Antichrist. We have that in the store. We have your E.E. Fisher or E.E. The St. John Fisher book. E.E. help me out here.
Oh, I wasn't muted. How about that? E.E. Reynolds.
E.E. Reynolds' biography of St. John Fisher, which, if you've never read the story of St. John Fisher, this is not just about his head being cut off. He actually lived he was a very old man. He was in his 80s when Henry VIII mercilessly had him murdered, had him slaughtered there in front of a crowd, and then had his head boiled and placed on a pike, parboiled as they call it. But John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. The story of this man, the story of his life is just, why hasn't anyone made a movie about this guy? You know, they made a movie with Robert Shaw back in the 60s, The Man for All Seasons, about Thomas More. And I think that they kind of had some St. John Fisher in there, but why a movie about this man's life has never been made is beyond me, because that story is just, it'll blow you away.
Well, I explained a little bit in the editor's preface, but it is also in the talk I gave in Denver on St. John Fisher. Essentially, that More is more attractive to the layman, but more importantly, he's more ubiquitous historically. Because as a secular person, as a lawyer, as someone who's also witty and amusing, even though for the thrust of where the historians are going, he seems to be on the wrong side, he's like, his unfortunate bumps, he can still be acknowledged to be a great man. And what do you do with someone like Fisher? Completely overthrows all the narratives, all the phony historical sound bites from your death by textbook history that's trying to get you into this mold that they want to create you in. So, I mean, just throws all everything out about the backwards church, the corrupt church, actually, because this is what we're going to talk about today. And actually, we're going to summarize how he is a proponent of church reform. But so they can't secularize that. They can't make it fit the narrative. They can present more as a bump on the road to this eventual great enlightenment. But you can't do that with Fisher. So that's why he just has to be liquidated. There's various people that they do that with. They liquidate them because their presence is just inconvenient.
But we have the book. If you haven't read it, it's in the Founders Trading Post at MikeChurch.com. Now, on today's subject, we're going to say goodbye to our Facebook Live preview audience. So y'all can join us at CrusadeChannel.com. Click the listen button at the top right-hand corner of the page, or just download the app onto your phone. And either if you're not a member, then use the non-membership block, and you can listen there, or go to CrusadeChannel.com. So thanks for watching today. Yesterday and all week long, we've been talking about the Reformation, Luther's Revolution, more properly put. And by the by, our chat room is live. As someone just mentioned, in the chat room at mikechurch.com. Who put this in there? Jeff Schaefer. Chat numbers should be where they were during debate nights daily. Such a shame. Too many people missing out on great stuff. Well, there's a lot of people out there that got to work during the day, so I understand. But you could join the chat if you wanted to at mikechurch.com. Click the Mike Church Show live chat text at the top of the page. All week long, I've been calling it the devolution, the revolution, the revolt, which is what it was. And I've been trying to detail, and I get a lot of mail from our evangelical and Protestant listeners about, Mike, just because we're not Catholics doesn't mean we're reverent. We don't try and tell you how to worship. Why don't you try to? Why are you trying to tell us? And I keep trying to flesh this out. That look, Luther had some valid points. There was a need, and there's always a need. Today, there's a need to cleanse or to rid the church of either the lukewarm or the downright heretical. If Pius XI or X were alive today, there'd be what, 100 priests and 5 bishops that would be remaining. That would because none of them would sign the oath, right? Or did I go high on that? 100 priests and 5 bishops. I'm being facetious. The point is this. The life that was lived and enjoyed, I underscore this word, enjoyed, that saved so many souls in Christ-filled Europe, in Christendom, before the revolt. We cannot get back to that. And I'm not saying go back to milking cows and the agrarian lifestyle. I'm talking about the way that they viewed life. And they put it in the proper context for many, many centuries, almost a millennia. And, of course, they were working at it, but they had it in the right context. And that is, everything you do in your life can have a basis in the faith. And this is what strikes you over and over and over when you read the lives of the saints and when you read what life was like in any of the centuries of Christendom or the ages of faith, is like we were talking Halloween yesterday. This is a holiday. We have this view of people before iPhones and before the modern age that everyone lived in this black and white world. It was because color film wasn't around to record it, and all we have are paintings. That means it was all black and white. It was miserable. Hygiene was terrible. People died. No one ever smiled. There was no joy. There was no beauty, et cetera, et cetera. That's just a lie. That is a total fabrication. The life that was lived in those ages, was it tough and different than ours? Yes, of course it was. But they had one thing that we're never going to have, and our kids and our grandkids aren't going to have unless we restore the order and the unified titular authority of the Pope. I'm sorry. That's what has to be. The church has to be the singular authority on what the teaching of Christ is, because it is. And I have been informed by many. I try to explain. Look, my commentary is not about you. It's not directed at you. It's not personal. I don't hate you. I don't revile you, despise you, nothing of the sort. It's against the ism, Protestantism. Well, people say, well, what are you protesting? Well, the protest goes on today. The authority is still being contested. Ryan, in its lame ASS, lukewarm public presentation, the revolt is still going on. No, we're not going to do that. We don't believe that. So you see right there the impossibility of any unified Christianity. It's not going to happen unless it's the church that does it. At the time that we're going to discuss today, Ryan's going to lay the case out here that reform, Luther wasn't the only reformer. There are hundreds of people in Christendom that saw the same abuses that Luther saw and had already begun to take ecclesiastical action to bring them to an end, but to keep the unity of the church. That's our subject for today. Do we have 10 o'clock? No? Okay. So we can roll through this hour. I tell you what, Ryan, I just want to take a quick break just so we can separate the hours, and it will come right back. This will be a quick one. It'll be about 5 minutes. and then we'll get right into the discussion. How's that sound?
Sounds great.
Okay. Hold the line. Oh, before you go, did I say anything wrong in my introduction? You want to add anything or correct me on something? I'm usually below 1 point or two.
No, at least not yet.
Okay, good. See that? At least not yet. Don't worry, Mike. You'll get one. All right, brother. Sit tight. Ryan Grant of Mediatrix Press.com is on the Dude Maker Hire Skype line with us. Our phone number, 844-527-8723. You should go and join the chat room if you're not in it, at MikeChurch.com. Follow me on Twitter, at The King Dude. Tell you and your friends and all your family to like the Mike Church Show fan page on Facebook. You have 138 unlikes to do this week as a result of my post on Luther and All Saints Day today. I'm down 138 Mike Church Show fan page likes. I'm still happy, though. It's Mike Church Show here on the Crusade Channel. King-size truth from radio-size speakers. And welcome back. Mike Church Show on the Crusade Channel. Folks, you would not believe some people. You wouldn't. Their stories, dude. I'm going to write a memoir someday. It's going to be so awesome. Harvey Weinstein, the old Harvey Weinstein, would want to buy it from me. Kidding about that. 844, I don't mean for what you think I meant. I meant because it would be so exciting and so dripping with epithets hurled yours truly's way. So, Ryan Grant is our special guest here on the Skymaker Hotline. We're now going to reveal to you the truth behind what was going on at the time of the, quote, Reformation, close quote. There was already a counter-Reformation that was going on. The things that needed, some of the things, or many of the things, that Friar Luther was citing as incompatible with the church and its teaching and its authority were already being reformed. It's called the Counter-Reformation. Now, Ryan, why don't we know anything about this today? No one ever talks about this.
Well, part of it, there's a couple reasons for it. So I guess part of it comes down to science of history, Marxist school of history, other things, and I'm not going to go into all that, so it'll take us too far afield. But history is done principally by going to the primary sources, the things that people wrote, and taking a primary order in that. So things like not memoirs, things like journals, diaries, the things that people are doing daily while events are happening, have one of the highest places in terms of witnesses. Then you have court documents. Then you have, things like that all tell a story. Then you have the literature, the writings, then things like memoirs where people are recalling at the end of life. All these things are useful. Then you have archaeology and other things that help tell you more about, the different things from what we can observe even now about a given event, culture, whatever. Then you have the books, and I work on that side of it in the primary source end with manuscripts and translation and other things. Then there's the historian part, the secondary source, where the historian taking all this evidence and information is going to help tell you about it, interpret it, and that's a really important part of it too. And thus you get the books by PhDs that cost $70 and $80, and it's a bear, because a lot of times I want to buy these books and I can't afford that. And then you have popular books which are based on those, and then you have the bane and death of all legitimate history, the textbooks. And then you've even got worse than that today, the soundbite history, the real quick media presentable presentation. So here's the textbook sanitized version for propaganda purposes, the media sanitized official version of the Reformation. And we'll start by picking that apart and get us into the Catholic reform that was already going on.
Okay.
So the official sanitized textbook history. Medieval church had just lost its way, and everything's caught up in administration, and theology is all about parsing hairs and angels dancing at the head of a pin. And then comes Martin Luther, And one day he stumbles upon a Bible, a dusty book that he's never heard of and nobody really knows anything about, and marvels, oh, no, this is the Word of God and nobody knows anything about it. So he decides to reform the church, and he takes aim at abuses. So on that fateful October 31st, 1517, he nails with the hammer the 95 Theses to the doors of the cathedral at Wittenberg and triumphantly begins the Reformation. But the church isn't having it. The church won't reform. They won't listen, so they condemn him for opposing abuses and indulgences and the clerical things and whatnot. So Luther goes on. He burns the condemnation and goes and tells people the truth about the Bible. And this forces the church to reform, because it never could have reformed possibly without Luther. And that's basically your sanitized version. That's basically what we've been hearing all week, even from Catholic bishops. So I've been calling that Luther Fest. All these Catholic bishops running around, jumping up, telling us about how wonderful Luther was and how great he was for the church and how much we needed him, etc., etc. Now, almost all of that, in one way or another, is hogwash. Although it is based on a kernel of truth. There were problems in the church, because there's always problems in the church, because there are men in the church. And so that's why people are going to, there's always going to be sin, there's always going to be error, there's always going to be people trying to enrich themselves at the expense of Christ's faithful in the clergy. That's always going to happen. So let's break that apart, the whole myth-making of it. So the first thing, let's deal with Luther himself. The whole story of Luther finding a Bible, quote-unquote, that nobody's ever heard of before, even fellow Protestant, although enemy, on various points of doctrine, Ulrich Zwingli, he comes out completely again. He attacks Luther for that. He says, come on, nobody's going to believe that tripe. Don't you know the Bible's been around in Spanish and in French and in German for over 100 years? Everybody knows that. Nobody's going to believe this pamphlet. Well, no, until you give it about a generation or so, then they recirculate that one and people start believing it. So, the Catholic Church is hiding the Bible from the people. And that was told all the way when I had history in high school. The church chained the Bibles to the church so that nobody could ever get them and nobody could ever see the Bible and hear it. And it's a whole bit of nonsense. So let's talk about the knowledge of the Bible in the church at Luther's time already.
Ryan, quickly. Christopher, on your NPR report from last Thursday. No, don't play it. Don't play it. That's what it said. That one of the reforms that was approved is that, people and many Catholics today agree, and thankfully that these reforms happen. And finally, Catholics and all Christians were allowed to read the Bible in English. That was in PR last Thursday. We played the report on Monday to talk about it. So you just heard factoid number 1 destroyed by Mr. Grant. Just wanted to point that out.
So that doesn't surprise me at all, because people at NPR who do manage their religion section, they don't know anything about it. They're just going to, something they heard in school, and they probably looked it up on Wikipedia or something, for all I know. Actually, you probably get better information on Wikipedia than you can from that old narrative.
Well, yeah, because Wikipedia takes from sources.
Yeah, but it was the guy who did most of the report was Bill Moyers.
Yeah,
oh man,
it was weird.
I guarantee he really doesn't know anything about it, except whatever sanitized version he's been given. But let's break that whole thing with the Bible down. So already translations of the Bible were present in German. There were 5 of them. All right. Now the part of the reason that gives the appearance of truth to this particular myth is that Luther's Bible translation comes out at just the right time technology-wise. The printing press was now in vogue in all these places in Germany, and he's able to use that to publish a printed Bible. Whereas all the previous translations of the Bible into German were basically used by clergy to preach from and make it easier, and so you didn't have ready access. But here's the thing. The science of the time, just the actual science, the market forces, the realities of the time, okay, is that because the printing press only came around in the 1460s or so, roughly, and even then, it was just a gradual process of its dissemination. It was expensive. It was a serious trade. You had to learn it. You did get there faster than handwriting the darn book by hand, which took 20 years or something. But the science of the time didn't favor literacy. because there was no way to disseminate printed works so that everybody could read them, right? And so also your actual trades or your farming or what have you kept you so busy, there's really no practical application to widespread reading. So that, especially like in cities and towns and whatnot, you'd be able to read numbers and different things like that, but you didn't necessarily have to actually read, books or be able to read, whole arguments and everything, because you just didn't have the time, even if you had, the means. So, merchants know how to read and other things, and, and there's gradual literacy, but not a whole lot, because you don't need it. Now, what happens? But most people knew the Bible better than people today do. Right, with the printed word being everywhere in nice little cheap paperback versions, which would have horrified medievals, because their attitude is, this is the word of God, so we have to beautify this. We have to make it look as beautiful as absolutely possible. So it's illuminated, it's covered in gold, it's made to be just an absolutely beautiful production. That's why it takes 20 years to make a Bible. Right. So that's why nobody can read it. So instead what they get is they go to Mass and they have preaching. And the preaching is supposed to, illuminate what's going on in the stained glass windows. It's also giving a mind and a presence to all the things they're looking at. So that is the whole sense of the medieval life together, with the preaching, and given all those together, the sacred art combined with the preaching of the word in and hearing the word at Mass, because even extemporaneous translations were made. People heard it, and they knew it, and they knew what the stories were in a much better and lasting way than we do today, if people know anything at all about the Bible. The only century, I think, where people probably knew the Bible better than medievals would have been the 19th. So, and apart from that, it's like today, forget it. So that's one of those interesting things. People actually knew the Bible better, prior to Luther than after. So, because with the disruption, preaching, was getting to low points and other things. And so the widespread knowledge of the Bible was only a gradual thing. It was happening at the printed Bible, because printing was brand new and literacy was still really low. So it was, and so you look in England, for example, 5 years before Luther even got on the scene, John Colet, the Dean of St. Paul's, and we mentioned him, he was a big reformer. Colet published a translation of the vast majority of the New Testament in English, and anybody could have read it who wanted to. All right, and so even in England was much more restrictive on the Bible than other countries, and that was because they had John Wycliffe, and Wycliffe had mistranslated the Bible into various using various things that desacralized the clergy, changed the way the church is read various verses of Scripture, claiming, this is more close to the original. And but it was against what the fathers had said, the fathers of the church. So you're getting into that problem where early Christianity is not bearing out Wycliffe's analysis of desacralizing, changing words, changing context, even completely abusing the text in certain places. So that's why because vernacular Bibles are already at a strong movement there, and that kind of killed it for a while.
Right.
And then, but people still know their Bible really well. So it's, again, one of those myths of Luther. Luther just had one advantage. He had the printing press at his hand right then, and he also had secular support, especially from Frederick the Wise and others, and so he's got money coming in, so he was able to print up a Bible, and that is what gets him ahead, because there were already translations in German, and there were in Spanish and in French, as we mentioned, and the whole thrust of Catholic reform had already, covered it. The monastery that Luther was in, his daily life would revolve around the Bible, right? He was teaching Scripture, the breviary, all right? I mean, the monastic hours, the book of hours in the Psalms. You're saying the Psalms every day at different points, and they're embellished with Scripture readings all throughout, from the New Testament, from the Old Testament. There's no way whatsoever you could not know what the Bible was in those days, because your life was based around it as a monk or as a priest. Or
let me just reset this. Mike Churchill here on the Crusade Channel, King Size Truth from Radio Size Speaker. You're hearing the voice of historian and Latin translator and book publisher Ryan Grant of Mediatrix Press. A couple of things that stand out immediately. Number one, no, man, there was no Bibles. No, No, none of you Catholics, y'all wouldn't let anybody read the Bible. Nobody knew what it was until Father Luther came along. And if we hadn't had them reformers, then none of us would have had the Bible. So that means they didn't have the faith. They was all heretics. I'm amazed by this point here. I'm amazed that this point actually endures to this day. So that means that you think then, if any of this about this denial of Bibles or this prohibition that you can't have it in your language, any of this is true, then if you are a proponent today then of sola scriptura, that means that today is the highest pagan sinner day in world history, when stupid Bible-burning Catholics celebrate all. Most of those people can't be saints because they didn't have Bibles. They didn't even know what the Word of God was until we came along and translated and interpreted and enlightened everyone. So that means St. Augustine, heretic. St. Clement, heretic or apostate. St. Patrick, well, we need to dig that up, exhume him, put him on a trial, accuse him of being a heretic, and then burn the remains. Name your saint. If Luther's case is valid, and if the protest that remains today, that the only way or the proper way to get from earth to the court of heaven is by reading the Bible, then all of those, you people that live in St. Louis, change the name. If you live in St. Paul, change the name. If you live in a town that starts with Saint, change the name. Because almost to a man or woman, they were deniers of the Word of God. They deprived people of it, and if they did that, then they were causing people to go to hell. That means that they couldn't have been Christians, buddy. Instead, they was working their little G-man chores, and you Catholics and that Catholic Church has been doing it ever since. And you're still doing it today. It's a good thing you got reformers in there and good Bible people like Pope Francis in there. Now, I just gave you a comedic, satirical view of what has either been personally told to me or that I have personally either read, listened to, or seen, Ryan. So today, of all days for you to be on this show, this is like a holy high heresy day, if they're correct, right?
Well, absolutely. If they were correct, though, they could also show that from the work of history, and they can't, because there's too much historical information that, again, just doesn't penetrate to the textbooks. So therefore, it doesn't exist. We can just write it off. But as we mentioned, there's all kinds of stuff when you get into archives and you look at what was actually going on, that just absolutely vindicates that, at least in as much as, the church still preached the Bible. People were making commentary in the Bible. Luther himself was enlisted to teach the Bible. From 1511 until 1517, he taught the Bible. So the whole idea that he'd never seen a Bible before is just, it's just asinine, really. And it's just not at all, the case. It might be plausible that he had never seen like a printed codex or like the full thing all laid out in one book. That might theoretically be possible. And like the best university in the time was Erfurt. And when he was a student at Erfurt, he was only a bachelor's student. And those days, you couldn't get in to be messing around with manuscripts yet until you'd taken at least your master's, which he got later. So, so it's theoretically possible he didn't actually get to look at the codex, but that's a different thing from saying you never saw the Bible, which often would be in different books, for study and commentary, right? And so it is religious life and everything. But let's go further, though.
Sure.
So then, indulgences. The church was corrupt and selling indulgences to make money. Now, of course, this one's true, and this one you can't get out of as far as the sale of indulgences and some of the corruption. So,
sure.
And there's no reason we should want to do anything except for explain the truth. And yeah, it happened. But let's talk about what an indulgence is. So a lot of people think the church, basically says, give us money and you'll go to heaven. You're going to go straight to heaven. And, you won't go to hell. We'll get your relatives out of hell and get them into heaven, right? And there's a lot of people think that, and it's simply not true. So an indulgence is from the Latin indulgentia, which means forgiveness or pardon. And what happens is whenever you sin, in theology, whenever you sin, there are two effects. One is eternal, that's your damnation, and the other is temporal, right? It's punishment you undergo as a result of the sin. That's the things you endure in this life, the bad things in the world, bad effects from sins that necessarily follow.
Okay.
At some point or in some way. So when you go to confession, your eternal punishment is remitted, but your temporal punishment remains, and that's why you get a penance. So the penance is to be done to assist in remitting your temporal punishment, okay, the things that have to be suffered in this life. If you die without having made satisfaction for that temporal punishment, then that's why you'll end up in purgatory, because the purgatory, its existence is for one thing only, to satisfy that temporal punishment for sin. So now with the church, at least when you're on earth, the church has the power to apply the merits of Christ and the saints to, basically reducing the temporal punishment of sinners in purgatory. Okay, of people who are now there. Now, everyone in purgatory is saved. So just in case you have Protestant listeners really confused about what Catholics teach and think purgatory is like second chance or some weird made up thing, all the fathers teach purgatory. And even the Greek fathers, because today you get a lot of Greek Orthodox who deny purgatory, but the Greek Orthodox, they're Greek fathers of the church, like St. Basil and St. John Chrysostom and St. Gregory Nazianzen, they all confess purgatory. And it's based on this principle, right? It's a place where your temporal punishment is satisfied. So the church, because the Pope, has, temporal authority in all things spiritual, he has the power to give an indulgentia, forgiveness, and likewise bishops do too in certain ways in their diocese, for certain charitable good acts that will remit your temporal punishment for sin. So you look at an old prayer book and it'll say 100 days, and a lot of people are like, oh wow, 100 days off purgatory or whatever. Well, the church has never given any definition on how long purgatory endures. It's one of those mysteries that will only be revealed, when you get there, because there's simply nothing in Revelation that tells us how long it will be. It's somewhat, to each person, really. So even whether the concept of days exists in purgatory, nobody knows. The 100 days you see on this prayer of an indulgence of 100 days or something means the value of saying this prayer for 100 days, the spiritual merit for a work done with charity, with the love of Christ, and with faith, that value will be communicated essentially to the church's treasury, right? That there's the power of the church to remit temporal punishment. And so that effect can be applied to you, right? And so if you die in a state of grace, then that'll be applied to you. But an indulgence can't do anything for you if you're damned. If you die in a state of mortal sin, you're still damned. You're still, because you had that eternal punishment was not forgiven. And there's nothing an indulgence can do to forgive eternal punishment. So people get this wrong. Like they talk about the Crusades. They say that, the Pope declared that anyone who goes and kills Muslims in the Holy Land will go to heaven. And, sins will be forgiven. That's actually not what it says at all. There is a plenary indulgence given for the Crusades, so that if you died in a state of grace, then your temporal punishment would be automatically remitted by being in the crusade, right?
Okay.
Not that, go kill some Muslims and you're gonna, it goes straight to heaven. That's actually rather what we're hearing today, right? I think at the beginning of our show today, but that's the so that's the reality. So now what is happening, and this is a case where, so that's the doctrine, and everyone at the time that dealt with theology understood these points in doctrine. But what was actually being practiced was completely out of conformity with the doctrine, so that basically the praxis was ignoring the doctrine, much like we hear people talk about doing today for certain things. So indulgences were now being sold. It starts with Julius II. So he begins the plea because he's rebuilding St. Peter's. He's paying top dollar for Michelangelo and for Raphael to produce this great sacred art. And hey, I'm glad he's producing the sacred art, but it cost money. And so Julius II was cash-strapped. He had been at war in a lot of Italy to recover lands for the papal states that various other local lords had taken to themselves during the Western Schism or during the Avignon papacy when the popes were away. So now you've got to acquire, again, enough money to keep all this whole machine going. So he extends indulgences to Bohemia and Poland, and also through Italy. So the idea is that you can sell indulgences, and he commissions various bishops to do it, but they got to split the money with Julius. Then he dies, and Leo X becomes pope. Now, there's one place where this didn't happen, and that's Spain. And we'll talk about why in a minute when we get to who the reformers were on the Catholic side. But Cardinal Jimenez, the primate of Spain, he gets this bull from Julius II. He looks at it. And by the way, if you're wondering about bull, the phrase papal bull, it sounds really funny. Yeah, we know that, right? Well, no, the bull, it actually comes from bulla, and it's a special seal that's used to seal official documents, and that's where the word bulla in Latin comes from. It has nothing to do with the phrase bull, four-letter word, which can't say on air, but you're tempted to think when you hear a papal bull, right?
The entire Reformation was what? Bull.
Yeah. So Jimenez rips up the bull, and as a result, indulgences were never sold in Spain, and you never had really strong Reformation opinion in Spain either. So, or as a Protestant Reformation opinion, I should say.
So no indulgences sold in. No, man.
Not according to Julius's strictures, anyway.
Yeah, no, man. They're selling them all over the world. There's Catholics selling them everywhere. Our pastor told us that Pope was evil. He's selling them to Muslims, he said. This Johnny Meets history lessons, whenever we study this, it's very difficult for me in my former life as a neocon and as a mildly talented radio entertainer. It's very difficult for me to not get off the reservation and go completely stand-up comedian on this. Because as a historian, I hear it and I think, oh, duh. But I also think, well, why would anyone even believe some of this stuff? I mean, you might as well believe some of this stuff is so fantastical and so just dramatically overblown. You might as well believe, because it sounds, if you hear it told by someone that really believes this, has been taught this their whole life, it sounds as though that from the start there was this intentional leading of souls astray. That's what it sounds like. To believe this stuff, it almost requires me to be of the from what I hear and you saying, from what I know, the history has been quote history, close quote, has been presented, that the church as it grew was a money-grubbing, evil, diabolical institution. And from the get-go, its goal and its MO, its modus operandi, and all that it did was evil. The Easterns, the EOs, the Easterns and the Greeks were right to leave it in the 12th century because of a disagreement with a pope who was obviously on the take, who was obviously wrong and remains wrong to this day, et cetera, et cetera. You almost have to suspend any belief that there was anything ever called this thing called a Catholic Church, and that it was good. Maybe beyond the day that Saint John the Evangelist died was probably the last good day, or the day that Saint Paul had his head cut off and bounced 3 times where there's 3 fountains in Rome today, was probably the last good day for the Catholic Church. If I am to believe the history that is told as part of the Reformation mythology. It just does not square with actual history. And it's just, it's just shocking. It really is. It's so eye-opening yet simple that one of the two has to be correct. Ryan.
Oh, absolutely. And it's easy to find out which one. You just go back to the sources. And even in Protestant historians that are faithful to the sources, you still find a lot of the same things. So, but let's move on, though, for the sake of time.
Sure.
So now the next bit, Luther then, is disgusted with the practice of indulgences, and so he nails the 95 Theses and starts the great work of the Reformation. Well, this is, again, also, complete pure mythology, so this is the way it actually happened. So Leo X, as we mentioned, expands this the indulgence of Julius II, this ability to sell indulgences, and to, especially in plenary indulgences and other things. And so the people who, and the idea that's supposed to be behind it is for giving money piously to the church, thus you'll receive this indulgence. So Tetzel becomes like this big hawker of indulgences, ridiculously so. And he preaches stuff that is obviously completely out of whack with what the church actually teaches in terms of indulgences. And he's a Dominican. So he gets into Germany to expand, Leo X's bull on this, and so he's going in and preaching everywhere about things that basically really are like like Luther says in the 95 Theses, the coin goes in the cup, the soul goes into heaven, which is absurd. But it's more or less the gist of what he was actually Tetzel was actually preaching. So he gets into Wittenberg, and one of the things he does is he transfers the right of commissioning indulgences from the Augustinian monastery, where it had funded university studies in a certain Father Martin Luther's work, and transfers that over to the Dominican monastery, and so the Dominican convent. So that ticks off the Augustinians to no end. Right? The Dominicans are basically stealing, a source of income for them. So Luther's superior comes to him and says, "I want you to look into this." And the fruit was the 95 Theses, right? So now when you look at it, about the vast majority of it is Catholic. But it's basically a scholastic disputation, and written in just a plain Latin style, very simple, and just basically laying out, there's going to be a disputation. We're going to talk about these theses, right? And so the thesis is basically your statement of belief on a certain subject. And so, a lot of it wasn't attacking the church's theology of indulgences. It was attacking Tetzel and the things that he was preaching and the abuses in practice. And so there were a couple of things in there that were erroneous, but not too many. So now, the greatest myth of all, Luther never actually went down and nailed it to the door. Doing so was actually a common practice throughout Europe. Cathedral doors were often message boards. So, because they didn't have Facebook or anything like that back then, lucky them. So what would happen would be a clerk at the university would come down with a bit of glue or paste or whatever, and he would, glue it to the cathedral door. And that's essentially what would have happened. It would have been in Latin, and just announcing a disputation. It was a common practice throughout Europe. That's actually the exact same thing happened when Blessed Duns Scotus in the 14th century had the notice posted that he was going to defend his doctoral thesis on the Immaculate Conception. And so that thesis, or the theses that made up his doctoral presentation, that was pasted and glued onto the doors of Paris, right? So this is not a revolutionary act. Moreover, Luther didn't actually do it. And moreover, nobody really took particular note of it, except there was going to be disputation. Wow, cool, because people were really addicted to going and watching these things, even though they didn't speak Latin. So if the vast majority, or some might have known a smattering of it enough to get the idea where things were going, but they wouldn't, the average people wouldn't have been able to follow it that well. But it was just exciting to come watch the doctors debate each other at the universities, especially because you didn't have you didn't have TV, you didn't have even professional sports. You didn't get to watch people stand for the anthem and all this business, right? So the disputations were the thing you did, and it was entertaining to watch, right? Apart from any kind of church processions or other type of drama that you had going on. So this wasn't a revolutionary act. Luther didn't actually do it. And instead, he had sent it along with a letter to Albrecht of Brandenburg, the Bishop of Mainz, and another bishop. And so what happened is in the university, they actually made, people got really fired up about it. And some of the Augustinians are still mad about this whole business of the Dominicans. They translated it into German and started circulating it around. And that brought up Luther's fame and got him more popular. So that, and then he started, publicly opposing Tetzel. And that's when, they're going to start, the Pope got annoyed about it, so they called him to account. And then the whole process against him gets stopped because the local lord, Frederick the Wise, who was an imperial elector, he had intervened on Luther's behalf. Now, why did he do this? It's actually kind of interesting. Frederick the Wise had built a church where he displayed his very copious relic collection. It was a huge collection of relics, and that's where degrees were conferred from the university in Wittenberg and everything. Tetzel was preaching in the next province over. And so where are people going to go with their money? They're going to go over to Tetzel and get the indulgence and not go to the relic church and give money there. So there's actually a political and monetary power play in the background. This is why Frederick the Wise intervenes on Luther's behalf with the church authorities, because he doesn't want to lose the money that's going to Tetzel.
It could never happen that way. Come on. He didn't care about money. No, man. He cared about the evil Catholic Church with damning souls. Father Luther saved all of them.
So anyway, here's where we get to some more interesting stuff. So when Luther's condemned in Exsurge Domine by Pope Leo X, there's only 5 propositions there that deal with indulgences. And all of them, of course, Exsurge Domine is right. None of those statements of Luther that are condemned in Exsurge Domine have anything really to do with the practice or anything that was wrong with it. So, for example, one proposition is number 17. The treasures of the Church from which the Pope grants indulgences are not to the merits of Christ and the saints. And that's again false. That is contrary. It has nothing to do with the practice. That's actually against the theology. Indulgences are pious frauds of the faithful and remissions of good works, and they are among the number of those things which are allowed, and not of the number of those which are advantageous. As in, it doesn't do anything for you. That's completely false. That's against the Church's theology on the subject. Indulgences are of no avail to those who truly gain them, for the remission of the penalty due to actual sin is the sight of divine justice. Right? So nowhere in the Pope Leo X's condemnation of Luther is there any condemnation of an opinion saying you can't sell indulgences. They don't proscribe that opinion. They don't proscribe anything about what Tetzel was saying or anything like that. It's rather areas where Luther actually contramanded the theology. Part of it was Leo X was a son of a Medici, actually one of the greatest of them, Alessandro. I always get that right. Lorenzo il Magnifico, Lorenzo the Magnificent, one of the big Medici in the 15th century, and Leo X, his son. He was a piss poor theologian. He was, and so he had his guys who were the opposite, advising him, and they looked at it and they agreed. So one of them was Cagid in De Vio, and we'll talk about him in due course. He was a brilliant theologian, very well learned, and he looked at the whole situation and said, and of course, and he knew Luther was right on the practice issues and the things Tetzel was doing, but these propositions were obviously against theology, so those were condemned. So what actually was going on? Well, here's part of the key to understanding where Luther is going. It wasn't like a sudden initiative. Already in 1513, so we have, for example, his commentary in St. Paul's, well, it's not so much a commentary, it's more lecture notes, on St. Paul's epistle to the Romans. And this is where it's going in 1514 approximately. So in his lectures on the epistle, he teaches that the righteous, by reason of which the one-time sinner is now accepted by God as reconciled, is no more than a righteousness cast around him by God, imputed to him, being which, or apart from which, the sinner himself remains as he was before the divine acceptance justified him. And that which brings about justification is faith, and faith alone, by which term is meant the sinner's confidence in God's word, announcing the promise of the fact of salvation. No good works done by man can at all avail towards his salvation. Man himself is never anything but sin, for even after baptism there remains in him the tendency to do evil, which is itself sin, and so vitiates every action done by man. All man's acts are sins, But in the case of the justified, God doesn't hold this sinfulness against them, right? And so on it goes. It's there's no place in the whole schema for natural goodness. Even the most virtuous of the philosophers of the old pagan world are necessarily damned. There's no such thing as small sins, no such thing in God's sight as human merit. So Luther is already there. In 15, 13, 14, 15, 16, he's already at the faith alone proposition based on these particular lecture notes. And they were only discovered in the 1900s, just by chance. So that's one of the things of why history is always being revised, because there's always new primary source evidence that forces us to revise how we've done the history, right? So whenever they come out, revisionist history, I mean there's a sense in which you have people making up fake histories and things like that. But the idea that, history is somehow revisionist because you're saying something different based on evidence, that's what history's supposed to be doing, is constantly, improving itself. But anyway, that's a side point. So Luther's already there, and the indulgence thing is really just an occasion. And so he starts out, generally with the mold of a reformer, but he's already got this false and heterodox doctrine. And then he goes completely off the rails, and so he won't obey the church authorities. He won't submit, the Pope. So he's condemned in Exsurge Domine. Then he turns around and he burns Exsurge Domine and the entire corpus of canon law and calls the Pope the Antichrist. This is already in 1520. So the whole idea that Luther was a good reformer trying to help the church just condemned him because he was attacking their practices. Again, it's all mythological. None of it has any basis in fact. Then you get the fact that at the same time, there were already Catholic reformers in the field that were working, some of them in positions of power, right? Some of them doing actual reform. And that's one of the things to go into. So, at first we're going to turn around. I was going to mention some people earlier, but it's going to take too much time. So we'll just get right to Spain. I already mentioned him. Cardinal Jimenez Cisneros, if you're going to, in the Spanish, Cardinal Jimenez, as we usually say, spelled with an X. And Jimenez was a brilliant reforming guy. So we've got to talk certain words. So the Renaissance, it was already ongoing. What the Renaissance had produced good strains and bad strains, as anything does. But there was real focus on antiquity, the real connection to the classical world. Some humanists, of course, had gone way too far on that. They despised the whole medieval and hated scholasticism, and we'll see a few people like that. But the idea was recovering ancient texts, recovering ancient thought that had been lost, the improvement of Latin, the study of Scripture, the study of the Fathers, right? Because going back to sources, it was really important. And it wasn't that the Bible was never taught or read, because you can find copious commentaries on the Bible in the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th century, all being done in the schools by the scholastics, so to speak. But the main way theology worked was, you had the sentences of Peter Lombard. So Lombard was supposed to be the sum knowledge of all theology, just as Gratian was all the knowledge of canon law. And Aristotle was all the knowledge in philosophy, basically. That's kind of the way it had been viewed.
A quick reset. Ryan Grant, the publisher at Mediatrix Press, the translator of many works of Catholic fathers and saints, is on the Judemaker hotline with us here on the Crusade Channel, King Size True from Radio Size Speakers. This is our little discussion here about the Counter-Reformation that was already going on in Christendom at the time of Martin Luther's revolt. I'd also bring up, Ryan, and again, you're the expert on this, I just kind of play at this on the side. When I was editing Humility of Heart, I noted that St. Augustine had written what we would call in Latin the Inanato in Psalmus, and that is his meditations on the Psalms. Last I checked, that's in the Bible, the Psalms. Pope St. Gregory the Great, Nazianzen, or Nancy, not non-Zion, also had commentaries on I think is it the Book of Mark?
If I'm not mistaken, he has commentaries on all the Gospels.
Yeah, commentaries, and because Father Bergamo in Humility of Heart quotes them at length, and you start looking these things up, and you go like, man, these guys. It's obvious that there were in Catholic Christendom, there were libraries, very unbelievably stocked libraries. And Father Bergamo, who wrote Humility of Heart, must have gone to one, possibly in Rome, or maybe it was in Bergamo, where he had access to all these works, because he wrote that book in 1730, started it in 1730 and finished it in 1734, and got an imprimatur. He took it to Rome and got the imprimatur of his bishop. But the point is that he had access to all of these works. This is before Google, before any kind of internet, there's even a card system in a library, and filled throughout this work and any other work you can get your hands on are references over and over and over, either directly to a scripture verse or directly to a pope or a saint that wrote on or gave a sermon on that somebody transcribed that had scripture verses in them. So this entire mythology that all of Catholicism is made up by man and had no basis in the Bible, no basis in the teaching of our Lord, as we're learning again today, is just an absolute crock. I might even say, at some levels, it's an offensive absolute crock. You know, the idea that guys like you, Ryan, or like me, or Brother Andre, or David Simpson, or any of us, that we're so gullible. You know, just because our parents taught us, well, you will obey the Pope. You know, we had it drilled into us like the Pope was Hitler or something. And then, we walk around from the time we're children reciting who the name of the Pope is, what he does, what he has for breakfast, what brand of coffee he drinks, because we have to know it, because we have to obey it. This is just offensive stereotyping. There's no basis in fact whatsoever. What you're getting today on this show is fact. It is the history. And I'll just add, I am often accused. As a matter of fact, this morning, I was accused, as you and I were talking. Someone was in the chat room at MikeChurch.com lamenting the fact that I wish Mike still did history. I wish Mike, what do you think this is? If this isn't history, then please tell me what history is.
It's not their kind of history. It's
right.
Not the history that affirms whatever particular position that they affirm.
Well, it certainly doesn't affirm USA, 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 and star-spangled goodness and awesomeness and blowing people off the face of the planet and being the greatest country in the history of Earth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Anyways, I just wanted to drop a little commentary in on that. As I sit here and listen, I'm like making notes on my piece of paper. Exsurge Domine is an interesting. So is that, do all excommunications or admonishments, did they come in that form, Exsurge Domine?
No, that's just the first words. Exsurge Domine, rise, O Lord. That's the first words of the document. And so almost all Latin documents, their title is made of the first words of the document. So, and that's this one.
That's a psalm. Exsurge Domine et enter amici eos et fugiant quio deda deum affacia eos. Arise, O Lord, let the enemies be scattered, and let them that hate thee flee from before that face. Not bad for a couple of Catholics who don't have Bibles, Ryan.
Right, exactly. So that was condemning Luther's errors particularly. He didn't even formally excommunicate him. That happened after he refused to submit to it. So and actually at the time too, the condemnation didn't explicitly name, unless I'm mistaken, it didn't explicitly name Luther, because there's the hope that he would. It names the places, it names what's going on, and so, but it doesn't actually name the figure himself, because they want him. They don't want to completely lambast the guy and humiliate him, even though it's good. It's going to happen because everyone's going to know who it's talking about. So so you want them to turn around, right? And so then they're adding condemning the errors of Luther. That's added later. That's a gloss later as the document's archived and everything. So same thing for other condemnations historically. But it was absolutely clear who it was talking about. So you couldn't go wrong with it. So and Luther didn't submit. So then he was formally excommunicated. And then in those days too, sometimes that had to be confirmed locally. So that's why Charles V has the Diet of Worms, where he formally, Luther refuses to submit to the church, so the excommunication is fully published, and he is excommunicated in all of Charles V's dominions. But the German princes defend Luther, and partly because they're not all of them, some of them, partly because they're protesting Charles V's centralizing tendencies. So the protesting, they were the protesters. That's where the word Protestant comes from, not from the religious movement, from the political side, from the princes that were protesting Charles V's centralization policies.
Oh,
So anyway, back to the Catholic reform end of things.
sure.
So you get Cardinal Jimenez, so future cardinal. So first, he had abandoned ecclesiastical administration for the Franciscans, and he became an extremely, eremitical Franciscan. So he was living as a hermit. In 1492, Isabella pulled him out to become a bishop, which he didn't want, but he did, and then he became eventually the Cardinal Primate of Spain. And that was kind of it wasn't anything he'd ever sought, and if he didn't want it. In fact, when he was first a bishop, he refused to wear bishop's robes. He kept wearing his Franciscan habit. He would only wear the pallium as sign of office. And so then the Pope actually ordered him to put away his Franciscan habit and wear the dress of bishops because the people expect it. But he didn't want to. He slept on the floor. Incredibly holy and devout and learned man as well. So he founds the University of Alcala, and there he has he does a lot of work to produce the Bible, to get the Bible in print. So he gets all these manuscripts, the best manuscripts, and what he produces is called the Complutensian, because that's a Latin name for Alcala. Complutenses, the Complutensian Polyglot Bible. It has 3 columns: Hebrew in the Old Testament, Greek, and Latin. And then it also has footnotes referencing the what they call in Latin the Syriac, that is the Aramaic translation, or the Peshitta, and in sometimes other languages too. And so it was so brilliantly done. The type is brilliant on it. The manuscripts were the best available at the time. There were many other things about this Bible, and the notes were beneficial. So even if you didn't know Syriac, that is Aramaic, and you didn't know even Hebrew, the notes helped you. So if you didn't know those languages, it was all extremely helpful to you as a study guide. And this thing was an absolute work of genius. And then it was published in the 1500s. So 17 years before Luther, Jimenez, the Primate of Spain, published this great and immense and amazing Bible with the original languages and the Latin, right, to bring further studies in it. So that is something, again, it runs right in the face of that particular myth. Jimenez also got rid of pluralities, which is one of the biggest abuses in the church at that time. Bishops having more than one diocese, getting the income from all these dioceses, but living in none of them, living it up in a more famous city or in Rome, on the income. So Jimenez put a stop to a lot of that. Really went to great pains to reform the church all around Spain. So Spain actually appears in this time, while everyone else is having problems, as a really well-reformed church. So that the best theologians are coming from there. The University of Salamanca is founded there, where the scholastic methods of doing theology undergo a lot of refinement, and so it creates the culture in the spirit of reform that also then becomes to inspire the rest of Europe. And he also goes and reforms the Franciscan order in Spain. A huge influence that Jimenez ends up exerting, even long after his death, through the reforms in Spain itself. Then you get to, we should talk about Louvain, or Leuven. I mean, we usually say Louvain in English, but that's actually wrong. It's Leuven. And it's in Belgium. It is probably the greatest university in the Low Countries. And Leuven was, but that's where Erasmus comes from. We're going to talk about in a little bit, and some others. But and it had gone, during the previous century, it survived kind of the worst, fights between, popes and the French and other things and various councils. And it was set on, it was an excellent university in Reformed life. There are a lot of scholars there looking at reforming a system of theology. There were just disagreements on how to do it. So the most famous of all the theologians at Louvain, or reformers, I should say, he wasn't really quite a theologian, is Erasmus of Rotterdam. Erasmus of Rotterdam, he's a mixed bag, but a lot of the positive things he did really helped benefit the church, again, long before Luther was on the scene. So Erasmus, he's the son of a priest, which means as far as medieval life goes, he's a non-person. He's a person that's not supposed to exist. So he's sent away to a monastery very young, where he does learn Latin, but at the same time, he has problems in the monastery, He just doesn't take to the life at all. So he flees the monastery and manages to get hired as a secretary of letters to some prince, and thus he's free. Because he basically has nowhere he can go. He can go be a tradesman, or he can go away as a monk, but he's never going to amount to much being the son of the priest. So he breaks the mold, and by becoming the secretary of Latin letters for a local prince. And but then he's still short on money, so he starts taking on students, some of whom were Montjoy from England and others. And he hears about this other great guy, reformer named John Colet. Now Colet, I mentioned it briefly earlier. He was the dean of St. Paul's in London, and he was a really brilliant-minded Renaissance humanist. He'd studied in Italy under some of the best philosophers, and like Ficino and people trying to bring Plato back into in a common reading and whatnot. He'd studied under some of the best humanists. His Latin was excellent, so he came back with the mind of reforming the clergy, of getting the clergy better trained. Reforming preaching was one of the biggest things that were flagging at this time, was the ability of priests to give good and eloquent sermons to educate the people in the Word of God. So Colet, to aid this, translates the New Testament, most of it, into English, with some commentary on St. Paul, and it's published in 1512. That evil medieval church, they hated the Bible so much, they published the Bible in English, and anyone who bought it, who could read it.
No,
right?
That's the way it happened. No, they deprived everybody.
So in London, he starts reforming clergy, improving the education of the clergy, trying to solve the problem, of pluralities throughout England. He's a big advocate for reform, and so Erasmus, who's in Rotterdam, he's a big proponent of reform as well. Now he's got a very different notion of reform, though. So it's radically based on the scriptures, which is a positive thing. But at the same time, Erasmus ends up following the mode of people that hate scholasticism. Scholasticism, just worthless, pointless, barbarous Latin. We want it to go away. And then, so it's all about going back to the sources. Everybody should be learning Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. And to the point where that he would say they're not really theologians unless they know all three languages, which, has some problems with it. It's good to know them all, obviously. But the... excuse me.
Bless you. Wow.
So without that, you couldn't really be educated. So he's got this radical program of reform, and some of it being very good and some of it being very bad. Just cut off the church from the whole tradition is what it would do. And so he had a lot of informed criticism at Louvain. So you have John Latimus is one of the main figures, and he's also a big reforming scholar, wants to reform theology at Louvain, really concerned about problems in the church with indulgences and other things. So, he wrote a treatise on defending the actual theology of indulgences and whatnot. Latimus, already before Luther, Latimus writes a response to Erasmus, affirming the usefulness of letters, of Latin and the sources and whatnot, but but takes issue with Erasmus on various things. But the fact that this debate between the two can go on at all is evidence of the high reform-minded intellectual life that's going on at Louvain. So
Sure.
artists of the church is trying, and it's all based around Scripture and how the Scriptures are being employed and studied, which is again something that, according to the official history, is not supposed to be happening. Another guy at Louvain, besides Latimus we mentioned, and Erasmus, is Ruard Tapper. And Tapper was a Dutch theologian at Leuven, and he was also a big reforming priest. He was involved all the way until 1560s in reforming theology and other works, and especially in a lot of his commentaries were on the Scripture. And he also took issue with Erasmus on various things. He was present at the Council of Trent as a theological expert, and really promoted the studies of the fathers and great sources in different things. So he's another figure that nobody's ever really heard of. Is kind of in the background, again, because none of his works really have been translated as far as I know. Some of them are in Google Books in Latin, but so another great figure at Louvain, and there's various other ones too. You just keep on going down the list. then you get to England. So we mentioned John Colet. Well, Erasmus goes there to, because he's told all about various people there by his student Montjoy, and then he meets Thomas More. Now, Thomas More is interesting because he is not a theologian, and he's not in the ecclesiastical service. He's a lawyer, actually, and he mostly represents the city of London, and he also has, a couple territories he's the constable of. So, but he's also a humanist, scholar of letters, does a lot of teaching himself, and is present at Oxford. So he becomes a lifelong friend of Erasmus, and they get on very well together. Notably, they're speaking in Latin because Erasmus doesn't speak any English and More doesn't speak Dutch. So then Erasmus goes to found lectures in Greek and in Hebrew at Oxford with More's help. Now, More is a big proponent of church reform. He writes criticizing abuses in the clergy. When he does become the Lord High Chancellor, More is very much involved in correcting abuses and bad morals in the clergy, especially false devotions, because there were certain people running around saying, oh, if you do certain things, you'll never go to hell. If you pray the rosary, that even if you should die in mortal sin, you won't go to hell, right? Which, again, that's erroneous theologically. That's not true at all. But you had people, talking in this way, and More is very keen, ending abuses and whatnot. And that also meant, going head to head with Cardinal Wolsey, who was very much part and parcel of the old abuse system, and with the king's connivance, basically. But
so it should be Ryan Grant is from Mediatrixpress.com and has translated many works, including The Controversy on the Roman Pontiff, Volume 1 and 2, which was the subject of our show that Ryan and I did 2 years ago called The Modern Wrong World Made Right, where we covered the entire Volume 1 and Volume 2 of that series. And we will republish that someday soon and make that available on demand. Ryan also is a speaker and a writer. And you can find him at Mediatrix, Mediatrix, Mediatrix Press, all one word, .com. We have many of Ryan's books that he's translated in the Founders Trading Post at MikeChurch.com, including the biography of St. John Fisher, including Volume 1 and Volume 2, and the Antichrist volume of the works of Robert Bellarmine. There's also, I couldn't carry all of Ryan's books because he has too many. He won't stop translating them either. So what project do you have going now, just for that audience may be interested in assisting you with?
Well, right now I'm working on translating St. Alphonsus Liguori's Moral Theology. I'm trying to get Volume 2 out. So I've got some people editing it, very generously, some excellent people working on that. And I'm trying to get the last sections on the 5th and 6th commandment done so that I can get it to them, so I can edit what they've already sent me and get the whole thing done, hopefully to be sold by Christmas, or to at least be at people's doorsteps by Christmas. But that's, and I'm also working on Bellarmine. I just completed Bellarmine's treatise on purgatory back in August. And now I'm working on Bellarmine's treatise in defense of the Church Triumphant, of canonizations, relics, images, and things of this sort. So those are the ongoing projects in between republishing other old books, trying to get more work out. I've got a whole stack of books that need to be laid out so I can get them published as soon as I get done with the St. Alphonsus work.
Well, so you can reach out to Ryan again at MediatrixPress.com. And what we're talking about right now is the Counter-Reformation that was going on prior to Martin Luther's revolt of 1517 and beyond, and the famous thesis of 98 that was submitted to the church at Wittenberg that began the process of what is allegedly, or is known popularly today as the Reformation. But then again, when we study the history of these events, we find over and over and over again that the events as they are handed down to us today are not true, and that there's more urban myth and mythology behind current Protestantism or evangelicalism or, ecumenism, if you will, than there is basis in fact, which is kind of ironic because it is Catholics that are usually charged by our friends, evangelicals and Protestants, if there is any dialogue, of the ones that are subscribers to a faith that was entirely made up by man, has no basis in the scriptures, was and remains inherently evil, and is presided over by the Antichrist himself, the Pope. But as we see, prior to Luther, if anyone were to have said that, they would have been anathema. People didn't even think these things. And if they did, again, they would have been anathema. Why? Because there were evil, malevolent kings and dukes and princes were roaming the countryside ready to chop people's heads off and take their gold from them if they dared to say something bad about the Pope. No, because the faith actually was the faith. It was practiced and it worked. It brought beauty, goodness, and truth to the people of Christendom. Certainly not all of them, because men are fallen, and that's why we have churches, and that's why we have confessors, and that's why we have confessionals, and that's why there is a church, and that's why there's a holy day of obligation every Sunday, or a day like today on All Saints' Day, because the faith must always be replenished, must always be worked on, even the saints. There's not a saint alive. You know, in the book that I republished, Humility of Heart, the first line in the book from Father Bergamo is the line that he takes, which is that begins the whole work, and it kind of sets the whole thing up, which is there were saints that were poor, and that was evidenced by their impoverished state. There was saints that were chaste, and was evidenced by the removal from the world. There were saints that were this, and is evidenced by this. But in paradise, there are no saints that were not humble. None. And the operative point of that is when the saint, or when a saint, or when Catholics practice humility, and we have to practice it, we do things like, for 1,500 years, people have been going to holy days of obligation without questioning them. 1,500 years is a lot closer to our Lord, St. John the Evangelist, St. Paul, St. Peter, etc. I'm going to go ahead and take their word for it. I'm going to go ahead and think that they were correct, and I'm just going to go ahead and do it and not worry about what I think. When we do these things, in a whole world of beauty and of exploration, especially when it comes to the faith, opens up in front of us. You know, we often think that that history began when the colonists, or when Columbus came to Hispaniola. That's when history began. You know, any history before that was, again, people were dirty. It was in black and white. Everyone was miserable. You know, the Enlightenment hadn't gotten into the world yet. Why would you even want to know of or learn any of that? To make you miserable. And as we're learning today, it sounds to me, Ryan, like there were an awful lot of very smart, very holy men that never stopped working on the perfection or perfection through grace. Not that there was anything wrong with what had gone before them, but again, continued to work on it. Like you're talking about this Bible that was in 3 languages. It wasn't that Bible rejected a previous version, right? It was saying, hey, there's new material available. We got newly trained translators, and people are asking for this so they can write about it. So we're going to go ahead and translate this into this language to make research on it and composition on it easier. So it wasn't a rejection of what went before. It just kind of added to it, but it never dirtied up, or what's the word?
Well, it clarified, because actually what it did, they didn't actually, the Jimenez Bible didn't actually translate so much. We're actually getting into where that comes into play. But what he had done is to provide the original languages in an easy to read fashion, so that you could, although it was an expensive volume, but still it was much more accessible than if you, go to get manuscripts out of libraries. It was just impossible. So, but what happens then in Europe, though, is the humanists are moving, and there's a lot of various people, really great people of Reform opinion. So we were in England, we were mentioning Thomas More. And Thomas More is always a great support to the humanist tradition, but the biggest support in England for humanism after Colet is St. John Fisher. And of course, we did a whole episode on him, so we won't spend too much time on it. But St. John Fisher was a bishop in Rochester, and is a very holy bishop. He'd been offered richer dioceses before Henry VII died, and he refused to take them, trusting reforming his own diocese itself. He made sure all of his clergy were personally ordained by him, He resided in his diocese, which a lot of bishops did not do, and he preached, which almost no bishops did. And he preached to the people. And he used to say, if I don't preach to the people, I shall be damned. And so a number of his sermons survive. And actually what you see in John Fisher's sermons is the old medieval, not only the medieval system of exegesis, but the medieval system by which the people learned the scriptures. So he makes freehand translations into English from the Latin. And then as he's doing it, he's explaining it according to the commentaries of the fathers. But not in such a way, because he's preaching to people who are not learned, who can't read, but they can remember. So in the manner in which the popular preaching will reference so-and-so says this, and then expand the point more so they'll remember it. And, brings it into play with the seasons. He brings a lot of native examples that people deal with every day, which shows he was from Beverley in Yorkshire. And he must have, as a child, also dealt with a lot of very humble occupations, because the manner in which he describes a lot of things shows that he had done a lot of physical work with his hands, so he understood what average people went through. So he was always preaching to the people and trying to raise them up. He would go into the houses of people who were dying and give them the last sacraments, even though the houses were filled with smoke and horrible to go in. Sure. So for a bishop in those days, it was unheard of. So even before he gets into his direct controversies with Luther, Fisher already has a reputation as being one of the holiest bishops in Christendom, to the point where later bishops in the 16th century, who were famous for being reforming bishops, like St. Charles Borromeo, he had a picture of St. John Fisher in his study as a model of a true bishop. And again, St. Robert Bellarmine, when he was made a cardinal and then later a bishop, he read the life of St. John Fisher to gain strength and guidance for what he should be doing as a bishop. And so his influence goes for a very long time, a few hundred years, but then it gets eclipsed in the events of the 18th and 19th century, and then it disappears. We hear everything about Moore, but nothing about Fisher. So, but all of them very, very much on the favor of humanism and reform in the church. And again, Fisher's giving the people the scriptures, and you could see it. And these are in English. You can see his sermons, and you could see the manner in which he brings the scripture to the people, and it's documented very extensively in Reynolds's book, which you have there, which we put back into print.
Right. It's all good stuff. Okay, so where are we? We're still around. We're still before Luther.
We're still before Luther. So let's turn over to Italy. So now, and we're going to get a mix of people who are post Luther, but Luther doesn't impact them in any way because they don't know anything about him. So in Italy, you have reform that's been going on for a long time in various places, but the problem is really in Rome itself, where you have the corruption in the Curia and other places, and as a result, the bishop, so the Pope has the cardinals around him, and the curial incomes are dependent upon so many pluralities and so many other things. So the reform there is going to be a real hard process. But like any system, you don't see overnight reform, right? And it'd be ridiculous to expect it. It's just like if somebody handed us power, like we were talking about in the first few minutes about the problems with our current government, right, and the whole military-industrial complex. So if somebody puts power in our hands and say, okay, well, you're in charge now, Mike and Ryan, what are you going to do to fix the government tomorrow? Well, we have to respond, we can't fix it tomorrow. It's too big. It's too much of a mess.
Sure.
It's going to be a gradual process doing the right things. Well, it's the same thing here. So when you don't see immediate, curing of all the maladies in the papacy and the administration and the curia and other stuff, that's a natural problem with bureaucracies. That's just the way it is. Again, Christ didn't hand the world this church of absolute purity. He handed the world the church with men who are men, and so some are good and some are not, and you get things like this that crop up that have to be cut out, but it takes a lot of time to do it. So, but in Italy, right in the midst of the papal court, though, you get a really great reformer, Tomas Gaetano de Vio. Or just called Cajetan generally. It's actually where he's from, Gaeta. And Thomas de Vio became a Dominican, and extremely learned Dominican. And so he was present. He was at the Fifth Lateran Council, which Julius II had set up, and he was a big theologian at that council. Eventually, he was elected head of the Dominican order, and he started the reform of the Dominican order all throughout Italy and then wherever else his reforms could reach in the 16th century. He wrote a number of commentaries on St. Thomas, a number of other theological treatises, which were extremely good for the time. So it was even beyond the old scholastic system. It was really, really well-reasoned, well-thought-out works. Cajetan also was involved in drafting Exsurge Domine, and he'd been present as the Pope's legate to Germany at the Diet of Augsburg in 1518, where he actually spoke with Luther, debated with Luther, and he actually managed to box Luther into a corner and get him to admit things that really undid him. So Luther, for example, had appealed to the authority of a general council over the Pope. And this is an old argument. It had actually recently been condemned at the Fifth Lateran Council, but nevertheless, it was still a big argument people were making. Even Thomas More actually was given to this opinion because he didn't realize that it had already been condemned. So the idea that a general council is above the Pope. So then, Cajetan ends up by turning Luther around in his argumentation, ends up making Luther look like an idiot, because then he turns around and denies that general councils have any authority. He says, well, all the popes and the councils contradict each other. So, but by using the widest sense of the word council, and then, which is, again, how is it that you appeal to a general council to have authority over the papacy when those are wrong too? And so other things. So he debated with Luther, and then he was involved in a lot of the politics, continuing down the line. But he exerted a very strong influence in the papal court against a lot of abuses. And so he's already in high places, kind of laying the groundwork so that a lot of cardinals were really influenced by his theological work. And, some of the ones that would come along next were really important. So there's Cardinal Caffarra, who was a big reforming bishop, later becomes Pope Paul IV. Although at the time he became Pope, he was half mad and was extremely rigorous at that time on prosecuting heresy, which is both a good and a bad. So we'll get to that a bit later. He's one of those guys, basically, heresies under every rock, once he becomes Pope. But then you also have Marcello Cervini. Marcello Cervini later becomes Pope as well, Pope Marcellus II. He's actually St. Robert Bellarmine's uncle. And he was really popular in the papal court. So Cajetan was really a big influence on him. Later, Ignatius of Loyola is a really big influence on him, but he's always a reforming cardinal. And he was papal secretary for Pope Paul III, and he was always pushing the bill of reform. And so then he was sent as a legate to the Council of Trent, excuse me, along with several other reforming cardinals like Cardinal Pole. He was, throughout that whole time, a big supporter, again, of the early Jesuits and other reform movements when they didn't necessarily have a whole lot of support. So another big movement that happens in Italy, it's actually one of the most remarkable things of the century. It was a whole new kind of religious order. And there's another Gaetano, not the same as Thomas de Vio Gaetano, Gaetano de Thiene, who was a nobleman from Savoy, and then also a Dominican named John Baptist Carione. They actually founded an oratory in Genoa. It's called which made a lot of use of St. Catherine of Genoa's ideas, and she was a mystic in the just a decade earlier or so. And so Gaetano wants to organize this kind of thing all over Italy. So he ends up organizing a congregation named after himself. So they're called the Theatines. And so they're founded with extraordinary poverty. And basically, for the next 60 years, the name is used to mean a priest of a strict life. So it was a slow-growing order, but after 9 years, they were everywhere all over Italy preaching and running hospitals, running gaols, doing confession and spiritual direction. And so wherever you went, these were Reformed priests. And out of them came, a lot of reforming bishops. More than 200 bishops had come out of this order after 100 years. And so that's one of the things that later brings about the reform of the Curia. And they start before Luther, they continue after Luther, but they're not really affected by those events at all. They don't really know anything about it. They're already on the move to reform. And we can also add St. Ignatius of Loyola to this, only in as much as he didn't set up his order to fight Protestantism. He set up his order to be a missionary order in the East, and that's just kind of how it ended up going. So Ignatius was created by the wars of the time. So even though he's after Luther, it's interesting, he's not in the slightest really affected by anything that's going on with Luther, except in a handful of ways. So what happens is that there's a war between Charles V and people in his own realm. It's called the Commoneros revolt, where they got mad at the fact that Charles V was the king of Spain as well as the head of the Holy Roman Empire, and he was just dragging more money out of Spain to bring it to the empire. And so a lot of noblemen revolted, and they wanted to put his mother, Juana, on the throne as a regent until they could get a new king. And so Charles had to, go post-haste back to Spain and try to put down the revolt. In the meantime, his, all his troops in Navarre, in the Basque country, were left completely without any assistance. So the Basques, they went over to the French and said, "Oh, would you like to help us get independent of, Charles V?" And he's like, "Oh, wouldn't I?" Because the French are surrounded by the empire on both sides. So, so none of this has anything to do with Luther, but they go in and into Pamplona, and where it's just where the main Spanish garrison was, it was judged to be really weak. So they strike there, and unexpectedly it holds out, and they weren't expecting it to. And so there was a certain captain, Inigo, who holds the tide back and gets the morale of the troops up. Well, his leg gets shattered by a cannonball. So they, but the French are really impressed by their bravery once they take the citadel. So they allow him to be taken back to his ancestral home in Loyola.
Loyola?
So Inigo de Loyola becomes the leader Ignatius. And then the rest of the story, as like Paul Harvey says, now you know the rest of the story, right? Because, they're reading the lives of the saints. He's inspired. He goes to Montserrat, and he goes on pilgrimage to the Holy Land. The Franciscans kick him out. "Oh, no, we don't need any fanatics here. The Muslims will get after us." So he goes back, and he decides to go to school. He starts writing down the spiritual exercises, which is the fruit of his struggles against himself. So the first struggle he has, "Oh, God can't forgive me. My life has been so bad." And then he overcomes that after temptations to suicide and so many other things. But now the devil strikes again. "You're so good, Inigo. You couldn't sin. All your old sins are they don't even count." And then he's getting this temptation to pray. So he tells all the women that assist him in helping the poor, "Make sure to remind me every day. Don't forget the sins that you've committed," and whatnot. And so that he's always going to be reminded. And out of both these struggles, he, the fruit is the spiritual exercises, refining the work of the soul to move forward. And he gets disciples in Paris when he ends up at the University of Paris, just to cut the story just much shorter. And then, now that's where he had encountered Calvinism, and so for the first time.
Ryan, Ignatius Press actually has a really good DVD out. They didn't make it.
The Filipino Jesuits did, actually.
Yeah, and it's very, very well made.
Yeah, I saw it when it was in theaters, actually.
Oh, well, we have it in our store in the Founders Trading Post at mikechurch.com. I think we have 2 copies of it. I think Maggie O'Connell is putting it in there right now.
Ryan, real quick, question I want to ask you. I have not heard the name King Henry VIII throughout this entire week.
He doesn't come along because he's not part of the Reformation.
You don't want to mention Henry because Henry's kind of, again, a bump along the way. He's like the necessary link in the chain, but he's such a tyrant at every level. You don't want to bring him in. And plus, even for Protestants, it's somewhat uncomfortable because Henry's not exactly the hero you want to run to.
No,
because not only did he kill Catholics, he also killed non-conforming Protestants. That is, those who wouldn't conform to his view of what the church should be.
And here's the deal with Henry. Henry did not want reason he broke with the church is because he didn't want a divorce. That's not what he wanted from Catherine Aragon. He wanted an annulment. And Pope Clement, was it Clement VI, told him, "No, I'm not going to give you an annulment. I gave you a bull. 7th. I gave you a bull so you could get married." No. Or whatever it was he gave him. Because Henry married his brother's widow.
Right. Which required a dispensation. And so...
Right. So Henry didn't even want a divorce. He wanted an annulment so then he could go and marry someone else because they didn't have divorces then. So And when the Pope told him, no, I'm not going to give you an annulment, your case stinks, that's when he revolted. That's when he killed Thomas More and St. John Fisher, because they wouldn't go along with it. Because he wanted the Bishop of Rochester to go like, oh, all right, I'll make an exception this time.
Well, principally because he was the most famous theologian in Christendom, and he was extremely popular in the country. Even though he had no authority in the whole matter, because that would have been the Bishop of Canterbury. And that's why he appoints Cranmer, because Cranmer is the perfect court archbishop. The Simpsons most perfectly satirizing that, where they have the Reverend Lovejoy character who plays Cranmer, and he says, I now declare you, by the authority invested in me, by you, Henry,
and by the power vested in me, by you just now, I pronounce you king and trophy queen. In the name of the Henry, the Hank, and the Holy Harry.
So that's essentially why
Amen.
We're avoiding Henry VIII for the most part. Is one way or the other, neither helps nor hurts the argument. But Protestants are not going to run out to proclaim Henry VIII as this great, helpful figure and whatnot, just because he killed so many Protestants.
And English Protestants, for the most part, those that remained kind of attached to the church, we call them high Anglicans today, don't consider themselves Protestants. They just consider themselves cousins of Catholics, basically.
If they're Anglo-Catholic, if they're the certain Anglicans that are lower church, they tend to look at themselves more distinctly Protestant. And I guess high church too, to a point, to the extent that the high church Anglicans even still believe in the gospel or anything else. So the joke about the Anglican church is that it's preserved. I apologize to your Anglican members, but perhaps looking at what goes on in Canterbury, they might agree. The Anglican church has preserved everything except Christianity. You look into in a regular Anglican church, and what do you find? You got Union Jacks, you've got statues to poets and to who live bad lives or were atheists, or all kinds of peons to these heroes and figures of the English state, and so it becomes like a living hall of English saints, but not in a sense of the church triumphant, but in a sense of what's made England triumphant. And that's why Darwin's in there, and that's why Keats is in there, and his statues and whatnot. That's why Nelson is buried in what originally was Henry VIII's tomb, but in St. Paul's. Why is Nelson, who was a bigamist and had an illegitimate daughter and flouted the laws of the gospel itself, why is he in St. Paul's? Because he saved England from old bones apart, right? During the Trafalgar, the great victory where he dies, which actually is one of those things. He died at exactly the right time because he was already strongly disliked because he was a bigamist, right? And why is he even in the House of Lords? It's just because he won these naval victories. Well, so then he wins at Trafalgar and gets to die as a national hero, and that little chapter is conveniently forgotten for the purposes of patriotism. And so thus Nelson is basically beatified and canonized in St. Paul's itself, in this great, magnificent sarcophagus that actually Henry VIII made for himself, but then he confiscated it originally from Wolsey when he got rid of Wolsey, and so then he never got to use it himself, and then it just continued going, sitting around. So then they recovered it and said, hey, we got to use this for someone. Let's use it for Nelson. He saved us. He's the temporal savior from a French invasion. Oh, so and that's what the Anglican Church is now enshrining.
Well, and I also saw I saw an article the other day that some of the some people in England think that when Elizabeth finally gives out, stops breathing, and Charles has to take over, that Charles, seeing that the end is near for the Anglican Church and for the Anglican order, may actually, because with the liberal nature of Pope Francis, the current Bishop of Rome, may actually go like, hey, we could continue those discussions about, ending the schism, Your Holiness, if you want to have tea, you'll see. Ryan, before we continue, though, because I think we're going to run out of time. We're at 3.5 hours in already for the show. Is the discussion on Calvin and the remaining story worth saving for another hour, or could you squeeze it in 15 minutes?
It's probably worth saving for another hour, just because it's too much that's complicated to get into. It'd probably be better actually to turn to a few more figures actually in the Catholic Reform.
Let's do it.
How much time we got?
15 minutes.
All right, perfect. So I mentioned the Theatines, who become this reforming force. The Jesuits also, they come to Italy seeking permission from the Pope to override, use his authority to override the Franciscans' authority in the Holy Land, and give them the right to preach, to the infidel. That's what they want. And then, Paul III is really impressed. You got these guys that get in and they want to take oaths of fidelity to the Pope, and they're like, wow. In fact, he can't get enough of it. So he has, so he says, well, Charles V and I in Venice, we just signed an agreement against the Turks, and any pilgrim ships are going to get taken and the crew enslaved. So there's no pilgrim ships going right now. So you might as well stay here, stay a while, make yourselves at home, preach, and and I'll give orders to any of you guys with doctorates that don't have orders yet. So he does, and so they're kind of given permission by the Pope to operate. So they run around preaching in broken Italian, and even in spite of that and the language and everything, their devotion, their holiness, their prayerfulness kind of sets Rome on fire. And so priests that had never given sermons start going out and giving sermons. Priests that had lived with concubines get rid of their concubines. They take their income, they set them on their way. This is the concubine, and then they go back to being a priest, basically. Bishops, that are living, they get inspired. They start going back to their dioceses. They start, the work of reform. And so all around the city, the whole is on fire with inspiration. And that one of the greatest tools for St. Ignatius was the spiritual exercises. So he gets these translated into Latin so that they could be rendered into Italian, and he does some revising of them and whatnot. And they pass around. Various people read them. So again, one cardinal, kind of lay cardinal, kind of lukewarm and whatnot, he reads it and he gets on fire with devotion to the poor. So he starts feeding them from his own table in his cardinal palace, right, in his palatial cardinal's residence, where and this table still venerated St. Mary Major, and maybe people starting to figure out who this is. His family wants him to resign the cardinalate so he can get married and keep all the money in the family that he had as a cardinal, not knowing he's given a lot of it away. And so he secretly goes to a bishop that ordains him so that they can't do this, because once you're a priest, pretty much is almost impossible to get a dispensation to get married, so his family would have to give up. And then, he's later appointed to be the Bishop of Milan, Charles Borromeo, extremely influenced by the spiritual exercises of Ignatius, and is what makes him into a reforming cardinal. And he gets into Milan, and this is in the 1560s. There hadn't been a bishop in Milan in 125 years.
Wow.
And so he's the first bishop to actually reside there. Now, there had been bishops of Milan, mind you, but they took the money elsewhere and paid a vicar to manage the place. So the place was such a mess. So, for example, one of the sayings in Milan at the time was, si vuole andare all'inferno, essere un prete. If you want to go to hell, be a priest. Because the priests had their salary, and they used that, and of course, became members of various local mafia, ran gangs, they openly carried pistols, they got involved in a lot of different disputes, used the authority and the money and the prestige of being pastors in the church completely to their own benefit. And it was, huge disastrous stuff. The local aristocracy was at war with the Spanish. The Spanish technically ruled Milan, and the old aristocracy, loyal to the Sforzas, still ruled it. So it was a real tough balancing act. So the Spanish really didn't care if there was any kind of management and order in Milan. And Borromeo's coming kind of irked them because they weren't ready for a new power player in the whole schema. So Borromeo sends a couple of Jesuits into Milan to prepare his way, preaching, and then he comes in himself, carrying a cross and in humble beggar's robes, not in cardinal's robes. And then, he takes up residence there, and he starts setting the clergy in order and getting rid of guys who are just rogues, and working on promoting in assisting, good and upright men into the priesthood. And then all the environs around Milan, he becomes this real force to reckon with. And some people try to assassinate him a couple times, the Spanish once, the Sforza another time, and he survives it all. So he produces marvelous effects at Milan. It was a major work of reform, and he became kind of the model of a truly reformed bishop. So, and like I said, in 2 portraits in his study, where one was St. Ambrose and the other was St. John Fisher, right? They're kind of his inspirations. And reform in Italy, we can't close without mentioning St. Philip Neri, the Santo Amabile, the lovable saint. And St. Philip Neri also was inspired by the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. So he had... been a layman for a long time, and then trying to discern what he should be doing. Is he'd help a lot of people, spiritually direct a lot of people. So finally, a priest suggested to me, you should become a priest. And so St. Philip Neri had done that. And so then he, various, a couple of benefices, he offered mass, and he did a lot of spiritual counseling. And one day, while he was praying, this ball of light came and went down into his heart and expanded his heart like 3 times the normal size. And the effect was such that he was always hot. Even in the winter, he went out with the shirt open because he was always so hot. And of course, his body actually shows that his ribs were perpetually broken because his heart was larger than a normal heart.
I heard this story.
Right. And so what he does in terms of reforming the church and the clergy and the curia, he founds the oratory, and that's oratorians even today. I think Cardinal Newman was a member of the oratory of St. Philip Neri. So the oratorians, are with this purpose. They work with youth, they work in education, they work in different places. So in Philip Neri's day, it was principally as a confessor. He had nobility in the confessional. He had average people, he had youth, he had rogues, he had all kinds of different people, and he would give all incredible spiritual direction that changed people at all levels of society, and especially in the cardinalate. And then he became the confessor to the future Pope Clement VIII. And so the strength in which he could reach just becomes being such a popular figure. And again, a lot of youth movements, a lot of things that brought a lot of piety into the city, and at different levels. Not just the average guys on the street, not just lesser nobility, but the cardinals themselves. And the reform of the curia that eventually happens would be unimaginable without St. Philip Neri, right? And then you have all over Europe, again, all these great reformers, and there's another one I didn't get a chance to mention, Juan Luis Vives. Vives was a Spanish humanist. He had worked. He was actually with St. Thomas More. He was the tutor to one of Thomas More's children. He had tutored the future Queen Mary I for Henry and Catherine. So he has a lot of humanist ideas, and he'd worked around Europe as a tutor. Again, inspiring humility and prayerfulness in the aristocracy. There were a lot of guys like him too. So and then you have the last thing, the Capuchins. Actually, I just published a book on this subject. It's called The Capuchin Chronicle. It's a reprint of an older translation of one of the early chroniclers of the Capuchin reform.
We have Capuchin dark roast coffee in our store.
Well, there you go.
We do.
Well, it's where cappuccino comes from because of the color of their habits.
Yeah, because of exactly. And that's why I called it Capuchin Dark Roast, made by the Heavenly Rose Coffee Company. MikeChurch.com/coffee today.
There we go.
There you go. Read the book on the Capuchins. I don't have to go back to Mediatrix Press and go get another book.
That's right. So you have Matteo Basci, who is a Franciscan observant, and he was led by his spiritual life to try to bring the rule of the Franciscan life back to the purity of the rule in the time of St. Francis. And that was a problem because you had a lot of years of dispute. That was always the thing of dispute. St. Francis's rule is too radical. We can't live it. It's too hard. So you got you got to mitigate it. And various popes over the centuries had dealt with various Franciscan feuds. So finally they mitigate it. and they put it all into a nice evenly reformed order, so they speak, which is seems more lax than the pure rule of St. Francis. So Baschi decides, and he gets others together. Eventually, it becomes I forget how many are in the first congregation, but he manages to get permission to start a mostly hermit life, living absolutely according to the rule of St. Francis, absolute poverty, complete dependence on everything, not owning any property, even in common. And so eventually they're able to get it started, even though the OFMs, the Friars Minor, the observants, they had done everything in their power to stop this reform from happening. It's kind of, if you're familiar with the story of the Discalced Carmelites and St. John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, then this story gets familiar as you read the book, the Capuchin Chronicle, because the OFMs are also confessors to cardinals and whatnot, so they've got their ear. But the Capuchins come together, and they manage to live a pure life. They wear the very long hoods and this was kind of a fight with the OFMs that produces that. They claim that's the original hood that St. Francis wore. So that's why they wear the long, distinctive hoods.
Well, it's hard to see any facial features with the long hood.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, because on the Capuchin Dark Rose, the graphic that I found, every time I'd look for Capuchin, I can't. There's nothing there. They look like creatures out of horror movies because the only thing you can see is their eyes. If you can see that. By the way, I mentioned Father Maria Gaetano de Bergamo earlier, the author of Humility of Heart. He was a Capuchin.
Precisely.
In the 18th century, he was a Capuchin. So now is the Capuchin order, and we have like 3 minutes to wrap this up. Is the Capuchin order still around?
Yeah, it's still around. There are not too many houses that fit the mold of the original reform. We'll put it that way. In Europe, there's a couple. I know of one. Like there was a news story recently. One of the ones in Italy, it's still very close to that original reform. There was a prisoner who was sentenced instead of jail time to live and work in the Capuchin monastery. After 3 weeks, he petitioned the judge to be sent to jail instead because the life and the work was too hard.
Folks, we're going to have to wrap it up here with Ryan Grant. We'll revisit this on a day very soon and get the remainder of the Counter-Reformation story that was going on at the time of the alleged Reformation, which was not a Reformation. It was a revolution, as we've heard. That's an hour and 40 minutes of detailed history or an hour and 30 minutes, because we did the first 20 minutes or so on the war machine that is Marica. I don't believe you're going to find on very many radio outlets anywhere on earth these days. And the fact that we were able to do it today, thanks to the grace of God, on All Saints Day, makes it that much more relevant and that much more, I think, important. So let's make a plan to get back together soon and get to part 2. And I'll try to remember that we left off at the story of the Capuchins, and then we were going to go back to the story of of the reformers that came after Luther. And these guys were just some real nasty players. John Calvin, nasty. As a matter of fact, so much so that I don't believe there are very many Calvinists even left today that would be true to what John Calvin would say that they would have to be. But if we start on it, we won't be able to stop. So we'll pick it up on another day. Visit Ryan's website and support Mediatrix Press by going to Mediatrix, Mediatrix Press.com. Of course, you can shop in our store and buy all our books. So we have a great sale going on All Saints Day. Soul Cakes is our coupon code today for 30% off. It was a coupon code for yesterday. It'll work today. I'm sorry, Soul Cake, all one word, Soul Cake. And we learned the real story of Halloween yesterday with Charles Coulomb and the giving out of soul cakes at each stop on a Halloween reveler who was dressed up as a saint or a martyr in merry old ancient England. Today we learned about pre-Lutheran reformers inside the Catholic Church. Yes, they existed. Yes, the problems were known. And yes, most of them, as you've heard today, were addressed. So we'll pick that story up, and we'll catch it on another day. Ryan, thank you, brother, for your time, and also for the knowledge. I don't know how you cram all that stuff into one noggin. I really don't.
I learned most of it before I had kids, so that helped.
So again, I ask all of you to support Mediatrix Press and to support Ryan's work, because he is resurrecting works from the dead of books and a text that many people didn't know existed. Most of them were written in foreign languages, principally in French, Italian, mostly in Latin, though. And he's getting them all translated into English so that you can read them. It's a pretty thankless job, but he continues apache. And we all thank you for it, brother. Look, we'll catch up later on today, and we'll talk soon about scheduling part 2 of this, okay?
Okay, sounds great. If you've been browsing the internet in the last 2 years, or been on Facebook and various Catholic circles, you may have seen Mediatrix Press. What is Mediatrix Press? Where did this place come from? Mediatrix Press is dedicated to putting good books back in print that are out of print for no reason, or that some people think will make money, or other things of that sort. We exactly reproduce a book and retypeset it. So when you buy a Mediatrix Press book, you're not getting a facsimile copy. Everything is completely retypeset, and we add beautiful font effects, things that harken back to the Renaissance, where the time was taken to make books look rather beautiful, instead of just churning out a straight-up mass-produced thing where it looks like every other book. The point of this exercise, of course, is to get good books in print for people. It is a hallmark of a good Catholic life to have good Catholic books. And so we are endeavoring to get as many very good books as we possibly can back into print. Mediatrix Press has already published over 35 titles, many of which are reprints, but some of which are the other side of our apostolate, translations from Latin. You ever read a work by some saint and then said, wow, I want to get more from this guy? And then you read more and you find out that, well, he was never translated out of Latin. Oh, I don't know Latin. How am I going to read that? Yes, I'm not going to, people say. No longer. Part of Mediatrix Press's job is to translate works of theology from Latin and into English for access to modern readers, or scholars who simply haven't been able to master the Latin language. Currently, we are working on translating the works of St. Robert Bellarmine and St. Alphonsus Liguori. St. Robert Bellarmine, the great doctor of the Counter-Reformation, whose works were the standard of Catholic theology for 400 years, until the general loss of Latin in the Church relegated them to more obscurity. The next one is St. Alphonsus Liguori, the Church's moral doctor, who's been praised by pope after pope. And in the decree making him a doctor of the Church, Blessed Pius IX had said that Alphonsus had refuted every modern error. Obviously, of course, he hadn't lived to see the 1960s. But nevertheless, all the principles are still there. And that particular work from the moral doctor has been singled out more than any other work in moral theology. It's still in Latin, even though other manuals have somehow managed to make their way into English. So it has been our task and our job to make these writings available in the English language, which again takes time, it takes money. There's no one funding these works. It becomes a dig first, money later type of proposition, and sometimes that becomes very precarious, because Mediatrix Press is also a family-run institution. That is to say, it is run by me. So I'm Ryan Grant, the managing editor, founder, sort of translator, and I work very hard at this. And I work hard at this for my kids, wife, but also for you, the reader, for the average Catholic out there that just wanted to get a good book on something and they just can't find it. So we're trying to get as much in print as we can. This is actually a very laborious process. This involves copyright research. This involves layout and design and cover design, and I've learned some things over the years in that too. And then you have to go back and redesign all the things you've already done. And that's just more or less the way these things work. Therefore, we have established a way to support our work directly, besides just buying our books. Or maybe you want to buy books, or you've already bought them, or what have you, and you'd like to support us another way. So, through this account on Patreon, you can subscribe to us at $5 a month and receive a free ebook as well as our subscriber newsletter. And then if you were to subscribe at $10 a month, then you will get more than double the value, actually. You'll get an ebook every month, as we mentioned, plus the newsletter, but you will also get 10% off on the website and a free podcast every month, as well as an excerpt from a translation we're working on. Go to the website also and support the Adopt-a-Book program. The Adopt-a-Book program was conceived to help us reprint certain titles. And in exchange for adopting the book at the rate we set, you will get a dedication in the front of the book, which means that everybody who buys this book will know, hopefully stop and say a prayer for you, but will know that it was through your efforts that this book was adopted. And of course, you'll get your own copy. If the book is going to go to hardcover, you'll get a hardcover. If not, you'll get a softcover. There are very few that won't go to hardcover in some form, so unless they're just too small. That will be made clear in the listing on the Adopt program. So please help support our efforts at Mediatrix Press to really make these works happen, because these are important works for Western civilization, for history, and for the Church. And it's one of the best gifts that we can give, to hand on the tradition to the next generation, rather than consigning it to shelves and saying, all right, do your best, go find it. Instead, let's make it available to everybody. So please support our work. Thank you.